Our first guest speaker today is an associate professor at the Department of Economics, Ateneo de Manila University. She is also currently a research fellow at the Research Institute for Environmental Economics and Management in Waseda University, Japan. She was the program director of the 2014 to 2018 USAID Grant Energy Policy and Development Program. She also served as the president of the Philippine Economic Society in 2018.
And you know, Kuya Greg, she also received many awards. Some of those are one UP Faculty Grant Award in Economics for outstanding research and public service in UP Diliman, when she was assistant professor at UP. She is an outstanding youth scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology.
Aside from that, Kim, she earned her BS in Business Economics and MA in Economics from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She obtained her PhD in Economics from the University of Hawaii in 2012 under the East-West Center Graduate Degree Fellowship Program.
Also, her research interests include energy economics, economics of natural disasters, development economics, and resource economics. Now, I am super excited to meet our guest speaker, and I guess you all too. So let us please welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Mahalaya Virabago.
Good morning. I am Bundag sa lahat and magandang umaga. I noticed na hindi lang taga Visayas ang nandito, right? Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see it? Okay.
Yes, Paul.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much to UP Visayas, Tacloban College Economic Society for the invitation, especially to Mia. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you, Greg and Kim, for that very generous introduction. Okay, so the topic that you gave me is really very broad, no? So powering the Philippine economy, energy economics, and policy. So I'm really actually very glad to know that UPV has started to offer energy economics and policy or energy economics as a elective course. So I hope you will continue doing this. So I hope that my another objective of mine in doing this presentation is hopefully to entice you to continue doing research on energy. So not only UPV, but also the students from other university that we have in the audience. So what I'd like to do in the 45 minutes that has been allotted to me is to have a brief introduction of energy economics, and then go closer to home and explain what is happening in relation to the pandemic and this concept that we are hearing, energy transition, and then segue to one of the fuel that we are using, which is natural gas. And as mentioned in the introduction, I'd like to talk a little bit about outages and alleged or suspected market power in relation to these outages. Okay, so in the introduction of the webinar, you have this very beautiful video, so I'm very glad to see that. So what is energy economics? So it's a relatively new field, right? It's a branch of applied economics which focuses on microeconomic concerns of energy supply and demand and the macroeconomic concerns of investment, financing, and economic linkages with the rest of the economy. So we have here several keywords, right? Microeconomics, macroeconomics, supply and demand, and all this investment, financing, and economic linkages. So it's as if it already contains the whole gamut of the concepts that you've been hearing in economics, right? So energy economics and the energy sector is very complex. The industries tend to be highly technical in nature. It requires a good grasp of economic issues. In fact, if you're talking about energy economics, you also need to familiarize yourself with concepts in engineering and even in law. Okay, so each industry or sub-industry of the energy sector has its own specific features which require special attention, as we will show in the succeeding slides. Energy being an ingredient for any economic activity, as shown by the video, its availability or lack of it when you have brownouts, right, affects the society and especially you as a student in this time of pandemic, right? And consequently, there are greater societal concerns and influences affecting the sector. The sector is influenced by interaction in different levels, most of which go beyond the subject of one discipline. As I've said, you also need to familiarize yourself with concepts in engineering and even law. Okay, so what are these different interactions? So in a nutshell, you have here the local interaction, the national or the macro level, and then international, because we do trade. Okay, so, and then it's not just electricity, right? You also need to consider the fuels that are being used to generate electricity. Hence, you need to look into the different subsectors. So you have coal, you have oil, you have gas, you have hydro, right? You have renewables, okay? And one of the major energy source in the Visayas is geothermal, right? And then you have to consider the economics, and that will bring into the investment, the cost, the prices, the supply and demand, and then the profitability of entering into this business. So it's a whole gamut of interactions among the different players. Okay, so that's the background. So let me now go into the what we are experiencing right now, the COVID-19 pandemic, and these concepts of energy transition. Okay, so the Philippines Medium-Term Development Plan of 2017 to 2022, this is the plan, MTDP plan before the pandemic, is anchored on Ambisyon Natin 2040. I hope you've heard about this. So this Ambisyon Natin 2040 targets attaining high income status. Okay, and the economy was nearly on track with this ambition, high income status by year 2040. That's why it's called Ambisyon Natin 2040. And from 2010 to 2019, the average growth rate of the country is 6.3%. It's the highest 9-year average since the mid-1970s. So the country has apparently conquered the boom and bust cycles characterizing economic developments in the Philippines previously. Okay, so that is the situation before the pandemic. Now, then, electricity consumption was expected to grow nearly 4 times its 2018 level because of this economic activity. Right, so the concern is about attracting generation investments to meet growing demand, because if we don't meet the growing demand, there will be scarcity and another high racketing prices. Now, enter 2020 and 2020, and we experience this COVID-19 pandemic, and we see a reversal of fortunes for the Philippines. The economy contracted sharply amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The economy shrunk to negative 9.5% here, and this is the lowest since World War II. Okay, so because of this pandemic, right? So we go now to the electricity or the energy sector. It is commonly believed that due to its low fuel cost, okay, and high plant cost and high ramping inefficiencies, the least cost generation mix involves using coal here as the base load fuel, meaning it has the comparative advantage in serving the minimum load over a typical 24-hour period, such that it can run at a nearly constant rate or at a near maximum capacity. In contrast, we have here, okay, the low plant cost and greater ramping flexibility of open cycle gas turbine plants, or OCGT, which make them suitable as peaker plants with a comparative advantage in serving peak demand. So meaning you only use it when there's when demand is peaking. Now, the higher plant cost, okay, but greater energy efficiency of combined cycle gas turbines, or CCGT, makes them the least cost choice for hours of intermediate demand. Okay, so now, if you're a social planner, the objective is to use different electricity generated by the different fuel that gives you the lowest cost, right? So that's why we're looking at the low cost, least cost mix of this generation fuel. Now, how do we determine that? Which one to use? Can we use coal at all times? What about supplementing it with CCGT? So to determine the least cost mix, okay, we need this concept called screening curves, okay? Screening curves, we just plot okay, the average cost here, this is cost here on the y-axis, as the linear function. So it's just an annualized fixed cost plus variable cost per hour times the number of hours used. Okay, and this will determine at what load or hour the base load generation begins to be supplemented by the intermediate fuel, which is CCGT, and when those two are further supplemented by the peaking fuel type. So in this graph here, we already subtracted, no? We projected the future demand and subtracted the amounts to be supplied by geothermal, hydro, and BRE so that we can illustrate the least cost mix with only coal and natural gas. So we see here that the least cost milk has coal as the least cost generating fuel for the low demand hours of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. And then that will be followed by electricity generated by using CCGT. And that's how we determine the least cost mix to be used for the entire 24-hour period. So using screening curves. Now, because of the pandemic and the ensuing lockdown, demand falls, right? So we have all experienced this, especially in the months when we had the strict lockdown. Now, when demand falls, there is excess capacity. Now, the problem becomes choosing which plant to use and which to leave idle. From the screening curve analysis, we know that coal generation has the least variable cost, primarily because of the relatively cheap fuel, meaning cheap yung coal, even after adding for pollution costs, meaning taking into account the cost of pollution. So, in effect, the screening curves would shift down since we are no longer adding fixed costs. So, this analysis would suggest, okay, that coal would be the sole generating source for more hours of the day. So what happened in real time? So what happened is just the opposite. Coal generation was actually the one to adjust. It fell dramatically from 56% to 48%. So this is coal here, the brown one, okay? So one would ask, why this paradoxical result? One, because in the Philippines, we have these inflexibilities in legal rules and contracts. Renewable energies, or REs. We have this renewable law that assured mass dispatch of renewable energy so that the system operator is required to accept whatever is generated from renewable energy. Also, we have these inflexibilities of the supply gas arriving from the pipeline. You cannot switch off that pipeline, no? If you don't use it, then it will just go to waste. And hence, we have this take or pay bilateral contracts with Meralco that assure that minimum purchase of natural gas generation reflect the inflexibility in gas delivery. Moreover, this leaves the burden of adjustment falling on coal plants, a number of which had to temporarily shut down production. Okay, now, pursuant to Machiavellian credo to never let a crisis go to waste, some observers have advocated government measures to accelerate the transition away from coal towards renewable source of generation. Okay, so the implementing rules by the Renewable Energy Act of 2008, as I mentioned earlier, specify this so-called aspirational target of having 35% renewable by 2030 for the Philippines. Okay, now if we look at the figures, so this is 2017 and 2018. For 2019, it changed a little bit, but not so much. The share of renewables in dependable capacity is already 31%, this one, renewable, okay? And it includes geothermal, hydro, biomass, solar, and wind. Okay, now dependable capacity is the installed power plant that we can depend on that electricity will be generated. But the DOE rules or the RE rules specify that this 35% should be attained in terms of generation. Generation, this is the amount that we actually consume. And we see here that renewable only takes about 23%. So this is somewhat more difficult since the share of renewable needs to be 35%. Now, the question is, as we want to transition to cleaner energy, are subsidies for renewable energy still necessary? If we look at the figures worldwide, the Lazard levelized cost, okay, this is just a fancy term, but you can just think of it as a cost, okay? Cost of electricity for wind and solar for the US are already below those of coal and natural gas, okay? The cost of intermittency, because variable renewable energy are intermittent, meaning you only have energy or electricity for solar when the sun is shining, for wind when the wind is blowing. At other times, you can't generate electricity unless you have a very functional battery. So that's why there's a cost to that intermittency. Okay, nowadays, it's already quite modest, okay? Given the abundant opportunities for diversification, falling cost of battery storage, and possibilities for demand management. So even this additional cost of intermittency are already modest. So greater renewable mandates or subsidies could compromise. This could just compromise the objectives of EPIRA, which is affordability, reliability, and security. And it also can compromise the Tax Reform Act of 2017, which already include taxing pollution, mainly carbon or coal. Okay, mandates and subsidies also put RE renewable energy advocates at loggerheads with the DOE's declared technology neutral policy. Technology neutral policy of the DOE, they mean that whatever is cheapest, that we can supply the cheapest electricity and reliable electricity, then we let them come in and generate electricity. Okay, but given that solar is so cheap and its intermittency is manageable, the question that we would like to ask, why is adoption so slow in the Philippines? Is FIT or feed-in tariff actually retarding that transition? So for those of you who are looking for thesis topic, you may want to look at this issue. Okay, now, is consumer welfare or the well-being of the consumers likely to be fitted against the objective of a cleaner environment? This is actually a false dichotomy, okay? Consumer welfare is maximized by the least cost generation mix after including the social cost of pollution, meaning we already take into account the environment when we try to maximize the well-being or promote the well-being of the consumer and the citizen. Given the rapid reduction in solar costs, diversification possibilities, demand management, and cheaper storage, we know really that the transition towards renewable is coming. And this is what we all want, right? Transition to a cleaner environment. Now, the role of government is to facilitate this efficient energy transition, not force it prematurely with costly subsidies. And take note the word transition, right? If you think of it in terms of drawing, transition means a smooth, right? Here from going below to up. And it's not like below and like that, it's an abrupt. So when we say transition to cleaner energy, there should be a smooth way of doing so. Now, we suggest some recipe for an efficient transition to clean energy. Efficient means no very low waste, right? Or having the least social cost, okay? The efficient energy transition should take into account the declining cost of wind and solar power and the low cost of managing intermittency. Taxes should reflect the marginal damage cost of pollution, especially from generation with coal. So meaning we recognize that coal is emit carbon emission that's bad for the environment and also for the health. So we can tax it. Okay, pollution taxes can harmonize the quest for renewability with affordability and other objectives of EPIRA. The social cost of pollution includes both domestic cost from carbon emission and the cost of local pollutants, which include sulfur, nitrous oxide, and particulate matter that impinge on health. Actually, in all instances, local pollutants are far more costly because this directly hit us, okay? The damage cost and add-on for natural gas is very small compared to coal. So we will see later that LNG or natural gas has a role to play in having this smooth transition to cleaner energy. Existing subsidies should be phased out in accordance with competitive costs, wind and solar power. Wind and solar has already become very cost competitive. So given that utility scale wind and solar projects are cost competitive with coal and natural gas, an investigation is needed into the relatively small investments in these sources that we see here in the Philippines. Existing coal plants and some new LNG plants can be part of an efficient transition towards renewable. It doesn't mean that we close down the existing coal plants that we have. Okay, after all, it's a big and lumpy investments, right? And if we close down all the coal plants and LNG plants that we have right now and just use renewable energy, it may not be enough to supply the demand that is required. Okay, so using COVID-19 to justify further subsidies is likely to be counterproductive. So more details about this can be found in this. So this is a very easy read. It's published in this Asia Forum magazine, and a more in-depth treatment of this topic is can be downloaded from our website at Ateneo. Okay, so now we segue into natural gas, becoming a bridge fuel. And this is a excerpt from the study gauging the market potential for natural gas among the Philippine manufacturing firms. So if you have questions, as Greg noted earlier, just write it down in the chat box and we'll tackle them later during the discussion. Okay, so just to make sure that we are all on the same page, let me just define what do we mean by natural gas and its different and how is it differentiated with liquefied natural gas. Right? So by the name itself, natural gas is a gas, okay? But it's still a form of fossil energy, okay? The largest component of natural gas is methane. It's relatively cleaner than coal, but it still emits carbon, okay? Now, liquefied natural gas is a gas that has been cooled to a liquid state. So that's why it's been liquefied. Okay, so now this technology has just been recently discovered and perfected. When I say recent, not naman like 2 years ago, okay? But it has been there like for several decades, but relatively newer than the other fuel sources, okay? So because it is now liquefied, it makes it easier to transport natural gas. And now it can be exported and imported. Unlike before, when it is in gaseous form, you need a pipeline to transfer natural gas, like what we have, no? So we have an indigenous source. This is in Malampaya offshore gas field. It's near Palawan, and the power plant that it's supplied to is in, if I'm not mistaken, Quezon. So there's a pipeline, no, connected from the source to the power plant. Okay, so we have discovered this indigenous source in 2001, and we've been using that mainly for electricity generation. Okay, so it took that lion's share. And then, but this indigenous source of natural gas in Malampaya is expected to be depleted by 2024, okay, unless we drill, okay, another source. So, but right now, there's still a talks whether the exploration in the nearby areas would pursue. So you can just Google it in the internet. What's the talk behind this, okay? But nonetheless, even if we do have existing deposits, okay, since exploration has not started yet, it may not be ready by the time na ma-deplete na itong Malampaya gas field. So if no replacement, there might be a possibility of a power crisis, especially in Luzon, since 29%, almost 30% of electricity is generated using natural gas. And if there's a power crisis in Luzon, it doesn't mean that it's only concentrated in Luzon. Of course, the whole country will be affected. The Luzon and Visayas grid are interconnected, although the capacity is very limited, okay? So the whole country will be affected, especially because Metro Manila, the main where the main economic activity of the country is located, will be very much affected. So, what is the possible solution? importing LNG, okay, is a possible, actually win-win solution, no? Because like what I've said earlier, natural gas has now been liquefied. There is now a possibility to import LNG. And the private sector knows this, that the indigenous natural gas source will be depleted in 2024. So there is now a race on who can first build, construct, and operate an LNG terminal. So it's a terminal. So it's like a bus terminal, right? Where ships carrying LNG would come in and go and even be a hub, okay, for the Southeast Asian region. So this LNG importation presents an opportunity for the Philippines toward a smooth and efficient transition to cleaner energy. Why is smooth and transition? Because there's not enough power generated from renewable energy. So it can pave the way. Okay, as a transition fuel, natural gas can ease the way towards cleaner renewable technologies as a substitute for coal and bunker oil as fuel to generate electricity. And in the process, we avert costly subsidies to renewable. And this is also good because the more expensive diesel is being used as input to production, especially in manufacturing. Hence, when it replaces this diesel, it can make our manufacturing industry also competitive because especially firms are looking for ways to lower the cost of their production process, right? Now, as the LNG or natural gas industry develops, okay, it's kind of chicken and egg, right? To attract the suppliers, we must be able to show that there is a use for LNG. And the use is not just electricity generation. So the current use may be expanded. Now, these special economic zones, have you heard of these economic zones? These are actually a sizable users of energy. Their energy demand and intensity are much greater than their non-SEC's counterparts because manufacturing firms can be concentrated in one area. And most of these firms or locators, what they called in SECs, their production process includes heating, okay, which currently use the more expensive diesel or liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, as fuel for their heating process. And also, the share of SEC's export to total export in the Philippines is about 85% as of Q1 of this year. So making their input to production cheaper, cost competitive, would mean that their product would also be more competitive and can compete fairly well in the international market. So given this context, our team conducted a survey among the firms in this SEC because we targeted SECs whose firms are engaged in the manufacturing business of these SECs. And let me just show you some excerpts of the result of the survey and our analysis on what would influence these firms to switch to using LNG as their fuel in their production process, not necessarily electricity generation. Okay, so most of these firms, manufacturing firms that are located in the SECs, they actually use LPG, okay, 42%, and also diesel, okay, diesel, gasoline, and these are more expensive and also contain more carbon, okay, so meaning it's dirtier fuel, okay? And when we ask them about their extent of knowledge on natural gas, we note that 44%, this is a big percentage, 44% of them have very limited knowledge on natural gas. Well, this is understandable because natural gas, like I said, in the Philippines is primarily used in generating electricity, okay? So, but nonetheless, even if they have limited knowledge, they have this openness, no, and they have a perception that they are open to switching to natural gas. And given their limited knowledge, we also ask them what would make them, okay, switch to natural gas? Number one, they said, would be compatibility of machines and their equipment, because to switch to another fuel, okay, in their production process would mean retrofitting their current production process. They are also concerned about the safety and security, and also, of course, the price. And they have here supply stability and reliability of the fuel, because they may be able to retrofit their production machines, but if the supply is not forthcoming, then there would be a disruption in their production. Okay, so to answer the question, what would influence the probability or the factors that would influence these firms to switch to natural gas? We did an formal analysis using the logit method and the OLS. I hope most of you are very familiar with this methodology. Okay, so we're trying to answer the question, what would influence firms to switch to natural gas? And from our analysis, okay, it's robust given the logit and the OLS method. It's the cost competitiveness really and the extent of knowledge. Okay, they are both significantly correlated with the locators or the firm's openness to switch. Okay, looking at the results, okay, this now is OLS, okay, those with heating component in their production processes and perceive natural gas to be more cost competitive. So heating one here, cost competitiveness one here are 37.6 percentage, has 37.6 percentage more likely to switch to natural gas compared to those firms with heating equipment but do not believe natural gas to be more cost competitive. For locators with no heating equipment, okay, this one, heating zero, but believe that natural gas is cost competitive, they are 28.3% percentage points more likely to switch than those that think otherwise. Okay. And then what we did is to rank, no, where the rank from highest to lowest, the different SECs. So this would be useful for investors who would like to target those who would have the higher demand. And what came out would be those SECs that are located in Batangas. So this just shows that there are more firms here that use or that have heating in their production process. What's the takeaway message from this exercise? There is the potential, okay, the potential is greatest among firms that require for their production intense heat, such as boilers. Currently, they utilize diesel or coal. Switching to natural gas is least likely among firms whose power needs are currently supported by electric utilities. Price, supply, stability, and reliability, and environmental concerns are among the top consideration for locators who show willingness to switch. Upfront capital cost of switching, including the stranding cost of replaced equipment, is also a major consideration among these firms. Natural gas could play a crucial role in lowering the Philippines' carbon emission, given that natural gas emits 60% less carbon dioxide than coal or diesel. Now, the role of DOE here is to facilitate the development of the LNG industry. The industry is responding, but its development should be nurtured by appropriate regulation. DOE can also facilitate the conduct of intense information drive on the minutiae of switching if and when LNG becomes available. Like the survey shows, currently the firms who can be potential users have limited knowledge. So it's important that they would also understand what's coming or what's in the offing. More detailed about this study can be found in this article that we recently published a couple of months back. And a more popularized version has been featured also in this broadsheet article, in Business World and Business Mirror. Okay, so let me now go to market power and electricity outages for the last part of this presentation. Again, if you have questions, you may already write it in the chat box so you don't forget. I'm going to have a different shift now, no, in the presentation. So it's focused more on electricity outages, and the treatment is more theoretical. Okay, so, and again, that first two presentation deals more about the fuel sources to generate electricity, and then the other one is expanding the use of energy, and this one would focus more on electricity. As an introduction, reliability together with accessibility and affordability makes up the three dimension of energy security. Okay, so when we say energy security, it has to mean reliability, accessibility, and affordability. Reliability of power plants is thus crucial to the nation's long-term security of energy supply. At the firm level, meaning at the power plant level, it is in the owner's best interest to ensure reliability of its power plant as it affects sales and therefore profit, right? So if you think of it, they wouldn't want to always have they wouldn't want to always shut down their power plant because that would mean no sales, right? But however, this power plant has to be maintained, right? So they are permitted to have outages, okay? So that's why they have these outage allowances. And declaration of forced outages is also inevitable. But sometimes when power plant declared forced outage, okay, it's being allegedly suspected as using it as a tool to exercise market power by withholding capacity to influence the price in the wholesale market for electricity, hence making a killing for it or making a huge profit, short-term profit, okay? So just to make sure, okay, market power, you're familiar with monopoly, right? If you have already taken microeconomics, you withhold the capacity so that there's an scarcity and therefore you can dictate the price. It's as if you're a monopoly, even for that very brief period of time and only in the wholesale electricity spot market. Now, you may have remembered this in 2016 where this persistent brownouts has started, both in Luzon and in the Visayas, right? And back then, we just finished our election in May 2016. And especially now it's election season again, right? And we hear in the news that DOE is saying there will be a stable supply of electricity because we are now using automated polls. So it's important to have electricity, the Wi-Fi, and the connection, right? So, but nonetheless, in the 2016, okay, there's this persistent brownout, and in the Visayas, you can see that it's concentrated during this date. So this is here, it's July 2017 to about August 1. Okay, and if we plot this, so this is just 2016, if we plot this against the price in the wholesale electricity spot market, when you have that outage, okay, when you have that outage, so it's decreasing the supply and therefore it's putting upward pressure on the price, at least in the electricity spot market. But note that the electricity distribution utilities only source about, on average, about 10 to 14% of their electricity source from the spot market on a monthly basis. Now, what are the reasons for this outage incidents back then? Okay, so if it's forced outage, usually the declared reason is there's this tripping of the line, internal trouble, hardware repairs, typhoon. This is acceptable, right? But typhoon can also be used as a reason for planned or maintenance shutdown because we know when the typhoon season is coming to the Philippines. Okay, and then for the planned or maintenance shutdown, the common reason is, of course, annual preventive maintenance, commissioning tests, and other things, okay? Then in 2016, so this started in 2016, and if you scan the news, you just Google, every year, we hear about these brownouts, especially in the summer. Okay, that's understandable because in the summer it's very hot. A lot of people are using their aircon or electricity, right? So we see these persistent brownouts, okay, during the summer. And this actually led to some groups that saying or allegedly saying that there is a collusion among the power plant generator. They collude in the sense that, okay, we talk about okay, let's have a coordinated shutdown, but it's a forced shutdown, okay? So that you decrease the supply and therefore you withhold the capacity and therefore raise the price in the wholesale electricity spot market. And again, you just scan the news, you'll see this DOE probing for possible sabotage, collusion among power firms. ERC, the Energy Regulatory Commission, is already wrapping up its probe. 17 generation companies involved in power outages. And then PCC, the Philippine Competition Commission, is probing possible collusion as power plant shutdowns led to rotating brownouts. And this news asks, is it weather or collusive acts? Antitrust watchdog probes power outages. Now, let's look at the share. Is there really a dominant position or the firms are abusing their market power? Okay, so if you look at the ownership share by capacity and by number of units, so this is as of 2018. SMC, San Miguel Corporation, holds the largest share by capacity, about 32%, followed by the Lopez's and the Aboitiz. In terms of the number of units, it's still SMC, okay, but followed by, but Aboitiz has more number of units, 22%, and the Lopez's has 12 units. If you look at some figures, according to this ownership, it's not necessarily that the big firms have the highest number of average force outages, okay, this one. So how do we analyze this alleged collusion among these firms? Because if they collude, it doesn't mean that it's only one firm, but they can act as one, right? If they can act as one, that's what collusion means, and have a semblance of a monopoly. So to analyze this issue, whether there's really a collusion among this power plant, among this generation plant, we need this concept of residual demand, okay? This is very easy. Do not be afraid of the equation. Okay, so residual, meaning natira, right? So if you have several power generation and there's only one, there's one that's biggest, you just subtract, okay, what can be supplied by the other power generation from the demand, and then the residual demand, okay, or the remaining demand is what we call the residual demand, okay? So you just aggregate the supply of the other generation companies. So the residual demand curve is the maximum amount of energy that can then be provided by the remaining supplier, and at each possible price given the offer curves of its competitors. So meaning taking into account all the supply of the other power generation. So as an illustration, so you have here the demand curve and you subtract all the other quantity that can be supplied by the supplier, and then these remaining ones would be what we call the residual demand. So hence that one supplier is now facing a downward sloping demand curve, and this would be what can determine the market price in the market, okay, the clearing price. So because it's already a downward sloping demand curve, it can act as a monopoly. And if it's a monopoly, right, the supplier can dictate the price. And you remember this graph from your microeconomics, right? So you have here the downward sloping demand curve faced by a monopoly. Its marginal revenue, its marginal cost. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost determines the quantity to be supplied by that monopoly. Going up to the demand curve, you have that price by a monopoly, right? So the residual demand curve summarizes the firm's ability to influence the market price by submitting a different offer curve while keeping offer curves of other suppliers and the market demand unchanged. Okay, now it may be inelastic or elastic residual demand curve. Okay, now in the Philippines, okay, we also have this different, we're an island, right? And we have these three grids, Luzon, Visayas, and then Mindanao. And as I've said earlier, Luzon and Visayas grid are interconnected. But the capacity of the interconnection is very small. So there is always that congestion. So if we ignore the impact of transmission constraint, okay, it can significantly underestimate the extent of unilateral market power. So what is that? I have heard about this anecdote. Okay, so there is a excess demand, let's say in the Visayas, and there is an excess supply of electricity in Luzon. But because there is congestion in the transmission, the excess supply in Luzon cannot go to Visayas to satisfy the excess demand. So now it becomes now, so here is a supplier, okay, of let's say a last resort supplier, and then there is no choice but to get electricity from this supplier. And this supplier, seeing the scarcity, can now charge a higher price. Okay, so that is what transmission constraint or congestion can also do to the market, where there is where market power can be abused. Okay, so transmission constraint increases residual demand within the area that is cut off from GenCos beyond the transmission bottleneck. Okay, now in the Philippines, WESM act as a residual market. So WESM is the wholesale electricity spot market. It is where the generators sell their excess capacities not covered by contracts, and where the customers buy additional capacities on top of their contracts. WESM only operates for Luzon and Visayas. Hindi pa siya set up for Mindanao, pero ready na daw ito, right? Now, we have these bilateral contracts among GenCos, GenCos and then the supplier of electricity, the co-ops and let's say Meralco, okay? Now, it's not an organized or centrally organized market, no? Bilateral contracts, it's kind of a fixed forward agreement where the generator agreed to supply Meralco at a future date for electricity, and then Meralco would then distribute it to customers. And we also have this ARCOA, okay, the fixed price retail load market. Now, the existence of this bilateral and retail commitments can mitigate the exercise of firms or generation companies and the exercise of their market power. Note that the profit gain and loss from a price increase, if they do withhold capacity, would depend on the difference between the supplier sales in the short-term market, let's say in the WESM, and its fixed price forward market obligation. So this existence of forward market obligations can actually mitigate market power. So in theory, your residual demand would shift to the left, okay, by that amount of your fixed price market obligation. And in this case, so you have your MR and MC, and you would go up only to this demand. Hence, you have a lower price. And the same thing, on the flip side, it can also move your marginal revenue. And again, MR equals MC, and this would be the price, which would be lower had the firms not have that fixed price market obligation. So what does this tell us? The exercise of unilateral market power for a firm would depend on the generation company's position in its bilateral contract, taking into account its utilization, of course, of outage allowances, because that is allowed by law. Since the Energy Regulatory Commission is the one who's approving all of these power supply agreements, where you have the information about the quantity and the price in the bilateral market contracts, okay, it has the information on the bilateral positions and outage allowances of generation companies. And thus, they have, supposedly, they can estimate this residual demand and inverse elasticity of generation companies, and can determine whether firms are exercising their market power or abusing their market power. Okay, in all jurisdiction, mainly in other countries, the regulators of electricity industry bears the burden of proof to bring alleged abuse of market power to a case. And we see in the news, PCC says that no hard evidence yet to prove collusion among power plants, because it's really very difficult, no, to prove this collusion. So you have to have an evidence, really. Okay, so in the Philippines, it's common knowledge that historically we have very thin reserves. Meaning parang konting-konti na lang, bumagsak lang yung supply, brownout na naman sa atin, right? Not unlikely that generation companies take this into account when formulating their strategic decisions in the wholesale spot market and use forced outages to exert their market power. Immediate technical audit to verify forced outage reports is prohibitively costly. Can you imagine if the power plant is in Visayas and they're reporting to NGCP or ERC in Metro Manila? Papadala ba agad dun ng engineers to verify? Totoo ba? Nagsasabi ba to ng totoo, right? Outage reports are typically taken as it is reported. Nonetheless, we can take lessons from other countries, no, who have these best practices. They are finding ways to establish clear and transparent rules in reporting and timely release of reported data on outages. The Philippines can learn from these best practices. This is called a sunshine regulation in terms of outage reporting protocol. In the long run, opening additional windows of competition can help mitigate the abuse of market power. One way to open another window of competition is to have a centrally organized, active forward market in lieu of this bilateral contracting. This can help increase competition even with a concentrated generation market like what we have in the Philippines. As a shameless plugging, that's the end of my presentation. Please do get a copy of our book if you want to have more in-depth look at the issue. This is just the tip of the iceberg. A lot has to be done on the energy sector. And let me take also this opportunity to let you know that this Republic Act creating the Philippine Energy Research and Policy Institute has been passed, okay, as a law. So there will be an energy institute, and this will be attached to the office of the UP president, okay? I'm very proud to say that when we first met with Senator Sherwin Gatchalian, this gave him the inspiration to push for the establishment of this institute. And we've attended several hearings at the Senate and also at the lower house. And it was Congresswoman Stella Kimbo and also the Speaker of the House who really pushed for the establishment of this institute. And this is very timely, especially for UPB, that you already have the starting to develop the energy economics course, because I think there will be scholarship for students who would like to pursue more research on energy. So daghang salamat, and I hope we can have a lively discussion later during the Q&A portion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving